First, a little bit about what your job entails and what you've discovered since you started it in November.
Yeah. As Bishop of Manchester, I take the lead for the Church of England in an area that comprises most of Greater Manchester and also some parts of the county of Lancashire. It's it's a role I'm supported by immediate colleagues. I have two other bishops working with me and a number of other senior staff in the diocese, because we are responsible for working with around 250 plus churches in the area, several hundred clergy, licensed preachers and other individuals who are leading worship and undertaking mission and ministry on behalf of the Church of England, and we provide oversight and support to all of that.
And what did you do before you became the bishop?
Well, immediately before I was Bishop of Manchester, I was the number 2 bishop in a smaller diocese, in the Diocese of Worcester in the West Midlands. So I was covering an area with a much smaller population, but with an urban north in the borough of Dudley, and then a more rural south in the county of Worcestershire. They told me when I came to Manchester to expect rain, but I think they've had rather more in Worcestershire than in Manchester of recent times.
Yes. The biggest, you've only been in post since November. I suppose, have there been any particular things that have surprised you in your brief tenure so far?
I think in coming back to Manchester, and I was born and brought up in the Manchester area, I think there's not a great deal that surprised me. The church is the church wherever you are. I think I've been hugely encouraged by the impact that local churches are making in their communities, the ways in which they're working either on their own or in partnership with other churches or other faith communities or the wider public to deliver social goods within the places where they have a care.
A couple of questions immediately spring from that. One about food banks. You were quoted in the Manchester Evening News as clearly not a particular fan of them. Could you explain?
Well, I'm hugely grateful for the work that churches and others are doing in running food banks, and barely a fortnight passes without me hearing of another one that's being set up by another church group somewhere in the wider Manchester area. At the moment, they're a necessary evil, and one of the things I've been challenging government to do most recently on an edition of Panorama on BBC One was to state clearly whether they see food banks now as part of the permanent settlement, if they're going to be with us for the foreseeable future, or whether they're an aberration and the welfare system ought to be changed to make them no longer necessary. I would rather they weren't necessary, but when we got 500,000 people, many of them, the majority of those are actually children, when we got 500,000 people who are going without food, needing to knock on the doors of a food bank, with the tremendous humiliation that's involved in that, then we can't just wind them up. Clearly they're going to be with us for some period of time, and it's obvious that local authorities in Manchester and beyond are beginning to recognise that and are seeking in what way they can to support the establishment and the running of the food banks.
And I really should have a follow-up question to that on food banks. So, what would you like to see happen? You'd like to see them no longer necessary, presumably, therefore, without wandering into the realms of policy too much, higher taxation or better enforcement of existing taxation laws, render unto Caesar.
I think one of the ironies is that the much of the money that's currently being saved in cuts to welfare benefits could be saved probably by if the largest half a dozen companies that are good at avoiding tax were paying the same tax that most companies are expected to pay in this country. So if the abuse, as I would call them, of corporation tax could be stopped, then there'd be more than enough money. But I think it's less really at the moment the focus around policy as around the implementation of policy. It does concern me that we seem to have reached a stage where there's a kind of belief among many in society that people are not really entitled to the money they get as benefits, and therefore it doesn't matter very much if they're improperly sanctioned or they face undue delays in receiving those benefits. Somehow it's become socially acceptable, almost as though denying people what they are entitled to is a good thing because it will encourage them to change their behaviour. Now, I don't believe in that, and right the way back to the Bible, there's clearly from the mouth of Jesus himself, it's stated that we should not hold back somebody's money beyond the day on which it's due to them. And that seems to be happening increasingly. Even at a time when unemployment is falling, the number of people who are being sanctioned on their benefits on job seekers allowance is growing rapidly.
A change of tack. Another thing in the Manchester Evening News, you've